The FX Audio L07 speaker amp is just $1 cheaper than the outstanding Fosi Audio ZA3. But the L07 absolutely destroys the ZA3 in one specific area, and that's going to be crucial for some of you. As a community of audio enthusiasts, we are currently flooded with all sorts of budget Class D amplifier options. I've already reviewed a few of these lately, and I've got a bunch more to share with you over the coming weeks. And the FX Audio L07 that I'm talking to you about today is a really quirky one. So let me tell you a little bit about it. And I don't want you to switch off this video too fast because some of what I'm going to say is not that great about the L07. But it does have one key feature that clearly and definitively places it ahead of much of its competition. And that's even though it falls quite short of that competition in some other areas. So hands off that skip button or that next video that you were thinking about watching until you hear me out on this one. The L07 comes in with a price tag of $149 and that makes it very affordable for a 200 watt Class D power amp, or integrated amp. It's got a volume control. At that price, it's just $1 cheaper than the ZA3 from Fosi Audio, which is excellent, and they both offer pretty similar features. The L07 can also be run in mono mode, so you can buy two of them for a dual mono setup. Both have comparable power outputs, although the ZA3 does have a slightly higher maximum peak power output, and both have XLR and RCA inputs. But then, things start to diverge a bit. Let's start with what's good about the L07. The L07 here doesn't need a power brick. It's got a main socket there, and that means there's going to be an onboard switching power supply built in. That's nice for reducing clutter and having less wires everywhere. The L07 also runs the MA5332 power amp chip, as opposed to the TPA 3255 that's in the ZA3 and the V3 mono from Fosi Audio, and a bunch of other amps too. Through my various comparisons and comparing like for like, I generally find the MA5332 to produce a more pleasing sound to my ears. Keeping in mind that there's all sorts of things that goes into the sound of an amplifier like this, it's not just the chip, but the amps I've tried using the Infune MA5332 chip have generally come out ahead of those running the Texas Instruments chips. As a side note, is it only me that finds it curious that both of these chips from completely different brands use the exact same combination of numbers, just in a different sequence? Coincidence or something more? So now let's talk about what's not so good with the L07, and remember, hands off that skip button. Firstly, the L07 has no standby function. It doesn't have auto on-off like the V3 mono where it senses the signal, and it also doesn't have a 12-volt trigger to be switched on and off by the upstream DAC. And so you're either going to be leaving it switched on all the time, which probably isn't a huge deal, but it is going to be chewing up a little bit of power constantly, or you'll have to be reaching for the power switch all the time, and that's around on the back. So that's probably a poor design decision, I think. Another feature that's lacking on the L07 compared to something like the ZA3 is it hasn't got a subwoofer output. Options like the ZA3 and the IEMS A70 that I'm also going to be reviewing soon, so subscribe if you want to hear about that one. Those amps offer a subwoofer output, which is really handy if your preamp doesn't have a dedicated sub out. There's ways around it. You can use the high-level inputs on the sub using speaker cables and speaker connections, but it would have been nice to see a subwoofer output on the L07. Another thing the L07 doesn't really let you do is roll the op amps. Technically, you can open up the L07. It's pretty fiddly. It's not really designed to do it. And on the inside there are 4 op amps, but I haven't played with them or rolled them because they're just too complicated to get to. Now, having said all that, if you like what I have to say about the L07, it probably is worth giving it a try with different op amps. I expect it would deliver a really nice upgrade. It's just a question of whether or not the one key feature I'm going to tell you about is enough to set it apart from other amps that are much easier to roll op amps in, like the ZA3. Because if you think about it, when you're rolling the same op amps through any of these amplifiers, they're all going to end up getting the same improvement. It's more about the base features and functions, and less about the starting sound quality, because a lot of that is coming from the op amps that are already in the amps. And so now let's start getting to the part of this review where I tell you why I said not to skip sooner, and that's in the sound quality. When it comes to sound quality, the L07 offers a slightly crisper, slightly more detailed sound out of the box than something like a V3 mono or a ZA3. It's going to come down to system synergy as to which one is better, because if you've got a system that's already quite bright, the L07 is going to be too much. However, if your room, your speakers, your preferences call for more detail and clarity in your setup, the L07 is going to be just the ticket. That's not the key feature though, we're coming to it. In areas like soundstage size and general technicalities like image focus, separation of sounds, I think the L07 and something like the ZA3 are pretty much neck and neck. So it's more just about the tonal quality, the sense of attack, the sense of clarity, the crispness of the sound. That's where the L07 may be better, or if you like a smoother sound, it might be worse. As it is at this point though, I would recommend separating these based on your preferences for sound quality and all the features and functions that you need, rather than getting too hung up on the technicalities because I think they're comparable. But let's pause on the idea of features and general sound quality, because this is where things get really different. The sound quality from the RCA input on the ZA3 is just bad. That's the Fosi Audio ZA3. As I said in my review of that one, you should only buy the ZA3 to use with balanced sources. And that's even if you plan on rolling op amps through it. The Fosi Audio V3 Mono, in my opinion, is equally pretty average when it comes to RCA input. And that is what distinctly separates the L07 from FX Audio. This thing sounds great when you use the RCA inputs. It sounds equally as good whether you're using the RCA or the XLR inputs. So this is the only amp that I've really tried so far in the non-kind of all-in-one devices. So you've got something like the SMSL AO200 Mark II, that's also a DAC, that's a bit different. But for a pure amplifier in this budget range with the ZA3 for instance, the L07 is the first one that I've come across in recent times at least, where you can plug in RCA or XLR and get equivalent sound from both. Whereas the ZA3 and the V3 Mono, in my opinion, kind of drop off a cliff once you go to RCA. Interestingly, with the L07, the RCA input actually has higher gain applied than the XLR input, and so that's worth taking into account if you are comparing them. You're going to be getting different volumes between the two, and the RCA unusually is going to be louder. Don't worry though, because I volume matched before doing any comparisons and forming my opinions. This is not just a case of louder sounds better. I made sure to keep the XLR and the RCA at the same levels before doing any comparisons. And the great news is that once they're volume matched, the differences are basically imperceptible. Now there is a bit of a delay between switching XLR to RCA inputs, and therefore I can't say that it's 100% identical, but it's close enough that I don't think you'd ever know the difference. And so that's really all I can tell you. The L07 is a really curious one. It lacks the features of similarly priced competitors like the ZA3 and indeed the AEMS A70. There's no subwoofer output or 12-volt triggers. It's harder to op-amp roll. It also has some slightly daft design choices like not only having no 12-volt trigger, but then also having a power switch on the back and no front accessible standby mode. But if you want a compact and affordable speaker amp for an RCA-based system, whether it's coming from a turntable via a phono preamp or maybe going through a tube preamp, then I think the L07 is actually the best I've heard for that. And it's not particularly close. The L07 on RCA input is vastly superior to the other amps I've tried in recent times. And so if you do need an amp like that for an RCA-based system, I'll put links down below through to the L07. As always, I also want to say a huge thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on videos like this one. If you don't need RCA inputs for your amplifier and you want the best possible budget and affordable and compact speaker amp, I've linked up here my review of the Fosi Audio ZA3 Next. As I said, don't buy it for RCA, but do consider it for any other setup. And so in the meantime, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.